Ladies and gentlemen, welcome, and thank you so much for coming to the National Constitution Center. I am Jeff Rosen. I'm the new president and CEO of this wonderful institution. I'm so thrilled to be leading it. We are the only institution in America that has a mandate from Congress to disseminate information about the United States Constitution on a nonpartisan basis. And to fulfill this mandate, we have three goals. We are the Museum of We the People, we are a center for civic education, and we are America's town hall, the one place in the country that brings together both sides of the constitutional debates that rivet Americans in the news and lets you make up your own mind. I'm so thrilled this morning to be partnering for the first time with my good friends at the Constitution Project. The Constitution Project also has a bipartisan mission. It brings together the top scholars and thinkers and public officials in the country, again from both sides of the political spectrum, and issues path-breaking and fair-minded reports on the issues of the day. And we're here today to discuss an extremely important report that they've just issued about detainee treatment. This is part of a new series that we've started at the Constitution Center called Coffee and Conversation. It's Coffee and Conversation because it takes place during the day. The evening version is called Cocktails and Conversation. And in fact, after the, if you feel inclined for cocktails, you're welcome to have those, those as well, because it's lunchtime. But we are thrilled that we're holding these events on a weekly basis. I gather that some of you were lucky enough to join last Friday when there was really quite a spectacular discussion of a new book about Oliver Wendell Holmes and the First Amendment. And this is part of that series, and I just can't imagine a better way to continue this discussion. I'm going to introduce our guests, and then we are going to have a conversation, and then we will ask for your questions. Before the introductions, I'd like to ask you to turn off your cell phones, which is necessary for any constitutional conversation. And once we invite your questions, just raise your hand, and our great staff will give you a microphone. So let me introduce the two members today who have joined us from the Constitution Project's bipartisan task force on detainee treatment. We have, first of all, David Irvine. He is a Salt Lake City attorney in private practice, a former Republican state legislator, and retired Army Brigadier General. He enlisted in the Army Reserve in 1962 and received a direct commission in 1967. He taught for 18 years with the 6th U.S. Army Intelligence School, teaching prisoner of war interrogation and military law. He was the deputy commander for the 96th Regional Readiness Command and served 4 terms in the Utah House of Representatives. And we were very honored to welcome the congressman here today. To my left is Ambassador James Jones. He is a partner at Minot, Phelps and Phillips, and he currently serves as the chair of the Task Force on Detainee Treatment. Before that, he was U.S. Ambassador to Mexico, as well as chairman and CEO of the American Stock Exchange in New York. He also was a member of the U.S. House of Representatives from 1973 to 1987. He was only 28 years old when President Lyndon Johnson selected him as appointments secretary, the position presently titled Chief of Staff. Wow, you were the most powerful guy in the White House next to the president. And what a great job. And I'm almost tempted to start asking you about that experience rather than detainee treatment, but that's a different constitutional conversation, so we'll have to wait on that one. He was the youngest person in history to hold this position. That is really saying something. Congratulations, and thank you for joining us, Ambassador. We're going to begin. Our two panelists, the Ambassador and Representative Jones, are going to briefly summarize the most important recommendations of this extremely important report, and then I'm going to jump right in and ask them some questions. So I'll ask you to begin, Ambassador.
Well, thank you very much, Jeff, for the introduction, and thank all of you for coming out. A little less than 2 years ago, Jenny Sloan, who's the head of the Constitution Project in Washington, called and asked if I would co-chair this task force to look into the detainee treatment since 2001, particularly the last 12 years or so, and to issue a report. I was reluctant at first because I had not paid that much attention to the subject, other than in my capacity of friends around the world in the diplomatic area, I would be hearing from several of them, particularly from developing countries, who were so saddened by the United States with our Guantanamo Bay prison facilities and the way they understood we treated detainees and didn't acknowledge it. Anyway, I took the task on. The task force was to be totally bipartisan. My co-chair was Asa Hutchinson, who was a Republican from Arkansas, who had been the Deputy Secretary of the Department of Homeland Security in the George W. Bush administration. We had distinguished people like Ambassador Tom Pickering, who's one of the most distinguished career ambassadors and diplomats in the United States history. We had people like Judge Bill Sessions, who was the director of the FBI and a former federal judge, a Republican from Texas. We had ethicists who taught at distinguished universities. We had Dr. Jerry Thompson, who was a distinguished medical professor at Columbia University. We had a good mix of people and totally bipartisan. We went through, and let me mention it first, our purpose was not to find fault with any particular individuals or to create a situation where the result would be prosecutions of individuals. Our purpose was to see what happened, see how the United States did treat detainees in our custody, and to see how policies themselves actually affected the way we treated them and the results of that. We wanted to look at whether or not, if there was torture, it had an effect in giving up good intelligence, and we started off with the hope that we could get a consensus, and we had a very distinguished staff. Nick Lewis, who some of you followed as a distinguished journalist from the New York Times, headed up the staff. We had very bright young lawyers like Scott Ream, who's here today, Catherine Hawkins, and others who did the staff work, who went along with some of the members of the task force to sites in different parts of the world, including the black sites that the CIA took people to at the initial time. And we had several hearings, not hearings, but meetings where we discussed what was found. At the end of about a year and a half of this study, we had a unanimous consensus on everything but one issue. That one issue was what to do with prisoners if Guantanamo closed down, whether or not to bring them to the United States. And so it was a very good exercise. We think the document, we hope you'll read it, long form or short form, either one of them, but we think it contains some good information. And what we're trying to do now is to get the Senate staff, the Senate Intelligence Committee staff, who's also done a very exhaustive official study of the documents, to release that document so that we can have a full picture of what we did and what we should not do going forward.
Thank you so much, Ambassador, for that great introduction. Representative Irvine, do you want to add anything or tell us what you think the main recommendations or findings of the report are?
Actually, general
first of all have to
supersedes representative.
No. I guess that's true. I'm being too Constitution focused in my.
I can't lay claim to having been a member of Congress, and I appreciate
the Utah House of Representatives.
Well,
in Utah,
that's a representative.
there's a huge difference between a state legislature and Congress, and I know my place, and
not these days.
don't want to step out of it.
My hero, Louis Brandeis, believed in the states as representative, laboratories of democracy, and he would have preferred the state house to Congress, I think.
Yes, well, we could talk about states as laboratories of democracy in the current political environment, but I'm not sure that's why we're here. I appreciate having a chance to spend some time with you talking about this report that we issued. And Jim has set the stage, I think, very, very well. I'd like to just tell you that there's a lot of information in the little booklet that you found on your chairs. This is a kind of an executive summary of a 600-page, very comprehensive, very detailed report. And we believe it is the first and most thoroughly researched report on the United States policies and practices with respect to detention and interrogation of, I'm going to use the word prisoners, during the 10-year war on terror. And I use that word prisoners very deliberately because by calling these individuals detainees, we have taken the first step in delegitimizing them as human beings. And as a nation, we made that decision very deliberately in order to avoid the consequences of having to treat them in a manner prescribed by the Geneva Conventions and other conventions of international law, had they been designated to be prisoners rather than something else. So the word detainees is a little bit fraught in my judgment, because we weren't just detaining these people temporarily. We have detained them now for 10 years. Some of them will be detained for the rest of their lives, more likely than not. And we have done so by virtue of a process that has not charged them with a specific crime in most instances, and we are detaining them in most instances without giving them an opportunity for any kind of a judicial or quasi-judicial determination of guilt or innocence. So the notion that a detainee gets some special kind of treatment is an interesting notion. They do get special kind of treatment, but it's not the kind of treatment that we would normally consider to be appropriate for someone who is a prisoner of our forces and has laid down arms and is not engaged in immediate hostilities or armed conflict. I'd like to go back to the photographs at Abu Ghraib, and those were for me a very defining moment. Jeff mentioned that I spent a good part of my career teaching interrogation and military law to about 1,000 Marines, soldiers, and airmen. And so when I saw the pictures at Abu Ghraib of prisoner abuse that you all saw, I was outraged that this could have taken place and was being perpetrated by American soldiers. That was not an army that I recognized, and I was so shocked about that I couldn't believe I was seeing reality. And I thought I was maybe the only one who felt that way, because I didn't know that my reaction would be typical of very many others. In 2005, I learned that there were a number of retired flag officers, generals and admirals, who shared a similar reaction to those photographs that I experienced. And in 2005, we began working to very vigorously oppose United States policies that we considered to amount to torture. And we had been involved in that and working very publicly and very vigorously in that respect. And so when I was invited to be a member of the Constitution Project's task force on detainee treatment and interrogation, I was very appreciative of an opportunity to have this experience. And we're now kind of beyond what was going on in 2003, 4, 5, and we've moved forward as a nation in many respects. But I'm going to share a quote with you and ask you whether this is indicative of sufficient movement in the most appropriate direction. With respect to Abu Ghraib, former Secretary of State Colin Powell described his reaction to that, and he issued a challenge to foreign audiences with respect to how we handled that episode in our history. And here's what he said to people around the world. Watch America. Watch how we deal with this. Watch how America will do the right thing. Watch what a nation of values and character, a nation that believes in justice, does to right this kind of wrong. Watch how a nation such as ours will not tolerate such actions. If you watch, you will see a free press and an independent Congress at work. They will see a Defense Department led by Secretary Rumsfeld that will launch multiple investigations to get to the facts. Above all, they will see a president, our president, President Bush, determined to find out where responsibility and accountability lie, and justice will be done. That was the challenge to the world that our then Secretary of State issued. And I'll just ask you, and you don't need to visibly respond to this, but I'll ask you whether we lived up as a nation to the suggestions by Secretary Powell of how we would respond to these very specific kinds of conduct that our forces engaged in. And I want to just emphasize one point that Jim suggested. This task force concluded unanimously, and I think this is the most important thing that we did. We reached a unanimous conclusion that the United States had, in fact, engaged in a policy of torturing many people who were in our custody. And this was not, it sounds like torture to us, this was not the standard of how you judge pornography, the Potter Stewart standard, I know it when I see it. This was an objective, cold, hard, analytical conclusion based on a lot of interviews, a lot of research, and a lot of soul searching that you could not square what happened in many theaters, in many circumstances, not by just a few bad apples, but by more people than we care to admit. Serious acts of torture were conducted in your name and my name, and we have yet to recognize or acknowledge this fact as a nation and as a people. And the lingering effect of that, in my view, continues to poison what we are trying to do even today. And I'll suggest to you, and I'll leave it at that for a moment, that what we saw in Great Britain when the Parliament voted not to go along with our proposals to deal with the crisis in Syria, we are paying a price still for a certain degree of duplicity in how we approached policy 10 years ago.
Thank you so much, General, for that very powerful introduction. So I want to begin by asking you, how was this possible? How was it possible that your commission unanimously concluded that the United States was responsible for torture in many instances and across a wide range of theaters, given the great debate on that question, legally and morally, that had taken place in the Bush administration? Ambassador, what definition of torture did you use, and how is it possible that people on both sides unanimously concluded that it had been met here?
Well, first of all, we didn't have any access to official documents. We had no subpoena power, so what we were able to get through the staff and through the meetings of the task force were personal interviews that took place all over the world with interrogators and those who were detained and being interrogated, visiting the sites, of looking at public documents as to how the treatment occurred, and then comparing that to norms of international law and national law. And virtually all of the U.S. laws that have been in effect against torture domestically, and all of the laws that we have subscribed to under the Geneva Convention were violated by the actions that were publicly available in documents and in interviews. So there was no dispute that there was torture. We unanimously agreed on that subject. So, and as David pointed out, it continues to haunt us today. It haunts not only those who did the interrogating in many ways, it obviously haunts those who were interrogated, but it haunts our relationships in all parts of the world. And as I said, when I first was invited to participate in this task force, at that time I had had a lot of comments and questions from colleagues and those who I've dealt with in the international diplomatic community as to why this would happen, why it could be condoned, how it could have happened. And as we delved into the subject, it happened. It was not unanimous opinion in the Bush administration that we should go along with these policies. There were dissenters, but those who were in control and those who had the access to the top decision makers seemed to take control of changing our policies.
What, General, were the kind of techniques that we're describing? We know about waterboarding and the so-called enhanced interrogation. What were the other forms of torture that you concluded were widespread and applied by the United States?
Well, let's also remember how we use language and the effect that it has on what is or is not prohibited conduct. The use of the phrase enhanced interrogation is a euphemism, and we developed that phrase to mask the reality, emotionally and otherwise, of what otherwise would be considered, without question, to be torture. So let me just very quickly describe some of the techniques that we refer to as enhanced interrogation. We engaged in ordinary, physical, brutal beatings. I mean beating the crap out of somebody to the point that they would be left with broken bones. We engaged in temperature manipulation, creating hypothermia, using sweat boxes, close confinement to leave people in sub-zero temperatures for prolonged periods of time. We engaged in dietary manipulation. We engaged in, and by dietary manipulation, I mean withholding food and water. We used electric shocks. We engaged in sleep deprivation for extended periods of time. We think that it doesn't perhaps mean much if we pull an all-nighter and go without sleep for maybe 24 hours. But psychologically, the impact physically and mentally on prolonged periods without sleep, that leads to a very quick degradation of mental faculties. We left people in a sleepless condition. We kept them in a sleepless condition for, in some cases, up to 72 hours at a time. We engaged in sexual humiliation and forced nudity. We engaged in waterboarding. We kept people in stress positions for prolonged periods of time so that individuals would be dangled from a ceiling or a door jamb, anything that would elevate them enough so that their toes would barely touch the ground, and this went on for long periods of time. What we did, and I could go on and on about that, but we took away the protections of the Geneva Conventions. And I'll just summarize what the Geneva Conventions mean in a very brief sentence that everybody can understand. If you're following Geneva, and this was military doctrine prior to 2001, if you're following Geneva, you don't treat other people, you don't treat prisoners any differently than you would want your best friend, your bunkmate, treated if he were a prisoner of war. It's the golden rule standard. It doesn't necessarily mean that we're offering people a choice of strawberry or pistachio ice cream and being tucked in at night. We're not talking about that. We're just talking about in terms of what kinds of protections you afford people, what kind of humanity you extend to people. Would we expect to be extended to our own soldiers, sailors, airmen, if they were in similar circumstances? We abandoned that policy. and we've paid a heavy, heavy price for it. That probably goes beyond what you were asking, Jeff, but we did a lot of stuff that nobody should be proud to write home to mother about. And if you talk with people who served as interrogators and who participated in coercive interrogation, the residual effect of what they did will haunt them for the rest of their lives.
Thank you for that answer. The powerful specificity of it, I think, was invaluable. And I want to ask you, Ambassador, who was responsible for this torture? Was this just rogue and isolated acts, or was this a systematic policy? And if so, what was the purpose of this policy
Well,
of torture?
in the beginning, the administration decided that the Geneva Convention protections would not apply to Al-Qaeda and Taliban detainees or suspected detainees. And so that took off the requirements of that we had before in the military, et cetera. The CIA was put in charge of interrogations. They had never done that before. Normally, that's an FBI responsibility. So you had a decision at the top that basically unleashed an ability to do things that we had never done before under the law. And as it drifted down, as a couple of Marine generals who had commented on this said, as it goes down the ranks, it gets looser and looser and more of a willingness or an authority to commit these kinds of acts. And so that started at the top, and that's what we looked at. Not who did it, but how did it happen? What were the policies that allowed something like this to happen that is so horrendous that we wouldn't put up with in normal circumstances? And I think that's where it really all started.
Of course, the Supreme Court later found that the Geneva Conventions did apply under certain circumstances. Did those decisions make any difference?
Yes. Those decisions changed many things, and our policy toward prisoners changed as those decisions were handed down. What did not change was a determination to not acknowledge that there had been anything inappropriate about what had been done. And we have adhered to a policy of euphemism, a policy of avoiding talking about how we interrogated prisoners, because that leads to uncomfortable political questions. And we don't like uncomfortable political questions. So we put them off. The people who got us into this probably meant well. Nobody wants to put Americans at risk. Nobody wants the nation to be insecure, to be vulnerable to a terrorist attack. But for some reason, a couple of psychologists determined that, well, hey, there's a program that the military has run for years called Survival, Escape, Resistance, and Evasion. And in this training program, volunteers, American soldiers, American pilots primarily, American Special Forces personnel, are put through a training course where they are subjected to really, really rigorous stress. They are subjected to the kinds of treatment that Americans who were captured during the Korean War were subjected to in Korea as a means of obtaining false confessions. And these guys said, we do this to Americans. We haven't killed anybody. And this is a shortcut to truth. If you put enough stress on someone and you break down their will to resist, they will tell you whatever you want to know. And that's where these methods of enhanced interrogation, so-called, in many cases, had their evolution. We took these psychologists who were advising the CIA, took these experiences and techniques that had been used by the North Koreans, by the Chinese, by the Germans in World War II, by the Japanese in World War II, all methods of coercive stress designed not in the initial instance by those nations and their armies to elicit truth, but to elicit a false confession to committing war crimes. This was applied again and again and again, particularly to American pilots who were captured. And they were tortured to get them to confess that they had been deliberately bombing civilians, deliberately massacring civilians, and so forth. So this, we call it SIRA training in the military. This SIRA training program was reverse engineered. And these guys said, do it our way, it'll get you truth, and it'll get it quickly. Only it didn't quite work out that way.
Was there a particular person who made the decision to reverse engineer this SIRA program?
Well, you had several involved. You had the Office of Legal Counsel, John Yoo, and whoever the other fellow's name was, the lawyer.
Stephen Bradbury.
And you had, obviously, Don Rumsfeld at the top of the Pentagon. You had folks in the White House. You had a lot of people involved in this. They have a political point of view that is very far to the right, and they thought they were doing what's right for the country. But in retrospect, it was terribly wrong, and plus it didn't work. What David talked about is this was designed to get information from those who might know that we could avoid another terrorist plot or what have you. Again, our task force looked at this, and if it could have been shown that the information we got from this enhanced treatment, torture, would have protected American lives, well, we might have had to discuss that. We did not see that the case, so it was not effective either, and it was wrong in the treatment.
So it came from the top. You're saying it was not a rogue program, and it doesn't work. A majority of the public still favors these techniques. 51% favors using harsh interrogation techniques to seek information about terrorist activities because they think it works. But you say it doesn't. Does it ever work, General? You've studied this. Does it ever work?
We can't say that it never works. A broken clock is correct twice a day. There are people who will tell me whatever they think I want to hear if it'll make the pain stop. There are other people who will not tell me anything, no matter how much pain I subject them to the point of death. And we have experienced both of those circumstances over the last 10 years. We have had multiple instances where people came into our custody, a couple of instances where these were reputed to be high-value al-Qaeda suspects. Now, we can probably have a debate about what a high-value al-Qaeda suspect may or may not be. But that was the appellation that was applied to these individuals. And in several instances, even though they may have had information that was critical in saving American lives, we tortured them to death before they revealed anything of any use to us. We have had experiences with people who also, under torture, gave us erroneous, false information. We went to war in Iraq in large measure based on the confession under torture, falsely, of a gentleman who stated that he was personally aware of the involvement of Saddam Hussein in training al-Qaeda in the use of chemical weapons. That whole confession of involvement turned out to have been engineered under torture in Egypt by a man who later, when he was released from Egyptian custody, returned to Canada and the United States and said, by the way, I just want to tell everybody I made all that up. They'd have killed me if I hadn't told them what they wanted to hear. But by that time, we were a year and a half into Iraq, and the rest is history. It's just not the most reliable method of gaining useful information. We've been doing this as a nation, as an army, for 100 years. We've got a pretty good idea of what works and what doesn't. The Brits have been involved in this. The Israelis have been involved in this. The French have been involved in this. There's a lot of experience worldwide in how to do interrogations. In 2001, there were probably about 20 strategic interrogators in the United States who had the capability and the skill to conduct a strategic interrogation of a genuinely high-value al-Qaeda suspect. And not one of those 20 individuals was housed within the Central Intelligence Agency. They were in the FBI. Interrogation has never been a core competency of the CIA. But suddenly, in 2001 and 2002, the responsibility for interrogating prisoners was turned over to the CIA. And as Jim indicated, we didn't have access to classified information. But there's a wealth of information available from public sources in terms of what these techniques and practices gained for the United States. And we could not find, as a task force, a single instance where coercive interrogation led to useful intelligence that prevented or saved the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives that torture proponents and advocates say were saved by coercive interrogation. We don't think it happened.
But what is the strongest argument on the other side, which is what the National Constitution Center and your group were devoted to entertaining? Defenders of torture say it does work, but the information is classified, so we can't tell you how. I mean, if you had to try to reconstruct the case for torture that persuaded its proponents, what would it be?
Well, we didn't find the case that torture came up with was an effective means to get information and to save the United States. That's why we've been talking to some of the senators up on the Hill who have completed a 6,000, I think, page document looking at all the official documents, memos, reports, et cetera, and official policy statements. And they've issued a report. We have not seen it. We believe from some of the comments of some of the senators that it will basically tell the story of what was right, what was not right, what was effective and what was not. And so we've been urging them to release this report. The CIA has been arguing with them over facts and disagreements on certain parts of it. We have said transparency is the most important thing. Get it out there. If you can't agree on what's in it and you can't agree on the facts of it, then let a minority opinion, let the CIA give their opinion, let the Republican minority in the Senate give their opinion, but get it out there, because I think it's very important to both unofficially, which we've done, and officially, which the Senate Intelligence Committee has done, get that information out, let us learn from that, and the lessons from that will hopefully allow us to take legislative actions to prevent this kind of thing from happening again. It still exists. If you look at Guantanamo, for example, there are now 164 prisoners at Guantanamo, at the prison camp there. We're spending as tax dollars almost $500 million a year to house them. The 84 of those, over half, have been cleared 3.5 years ago by a high-level panel of intelligence folks, of law enforcement folks. And they've been cleared to be released. And for 3.5 years, even though they know they've been cleared, they've not been released or transferred to another location. And that, in my judgment, has led to some of the hunger strikes that have gone on. Because once you take all hope away from a person, and they also cannot see any of their families, something we don't deny prisoners in our own federal and state prisons here. So they have not seen their families, in some cases for well over 10 years. They know they've been cleared, but they can't get out. They're still being treated as prisoners. And I think that's a wrong signal for the United States to send to the rest of the world of how we treat other human beings.
Say more about the current state of torture and the Obama administration. Both of you have called for transparency, but one reason that's been given for refusing to release the memos and records is the administration's desire to protect predecessors in the Bush administration from legal liability. Basically, this is Jack Goldsmith's argument in The Terror Presidency, that the current White House feels an obligation to protect the previous officials from being sued in international courts. And the Obama administration disappointed many critics of the Bush administration by refusing to support the prosecution of Bush administration officials. Is the CIA still in charge of these interrogation techniques? Has the Obama administration forsworn and torture? What exactly is the state of play?
Well, when President Obama took office, one of his first official acts was to issue an executive order that prohibited the use of torture or coercive interrogation anywhere in the world by U.S. forces, and that's a laudable step. We are not doing business today the same way we did business 10 years ago or 5 years ago even, and that's for the better. I think what has not happened yet, and one of the reasons that we are very interested to have the Senate Intelligence Committee's report released, is that this prohibition on official torture has not really been institutionalized in our view, particularly within the CIA. Now, we don't know that positively, but if you read the books that former CIA officers have published, where they very proudly defend what was done and insist that it saved thousands, tens of thousands of lives, and I'd really like to tell you how it worked, but it's classified and I just can't tell you what I know. But if you knew what I know, you'd understand that this is a necessary practice and we need it to keep America safe. When those arguments are made, I think a lot of us don't ask a couple of significant questions. And one question is, and I'll just talk about torture. So if torture is the shortcut to truth that its proponents say it is, then how many people who are actually innocent of wrongdoing are we prepared to torture to try to track down what truth is and where it might lie? And if we're willing to torture one innocent person to get to that elusive truth, are we willing to torture 5 or 10 or 20? How far do we go in looking for truth in dark, hidden corners where it may not lie? And I guess the second question ought to be, if coercive interrogation is really the shortcut to truth and the great engine for solving mysteries, why don't we apply it in ordinary domestic criminal law? Why don't we waterboard suspected kidnappers? Why don't we use temperature manipulation to deal with suspected armed robbers? Why don't we use these tools that someone has said are great? They're wonderful. They'll get us what we need to know, and they'll get it like that. Why don't we, if it's that great, why don't we kind of alter the Constitution a little bit and allow police forces in the states, those laboratories of democracy, to try these experiments out and see what we can do to reduce crime domestically?
I might just add one thing on your question. The task force took the position in the beginning that this was not a truth commission. We were not going after people and prosecutions. And therefore, in suggesting that all of these documents be made transparent and made public, we have no objection. to redacting names and protecting things like that. But I think it really is important to know what policies led to what we did and were they effective. And that's what we're looking after. So I guess we're not really arguing with the Obama approach that he's not going to go after individuals and with prosecutions, but I think it is important, and I think he can be criticized for not being as active as he should be in going after the policies and what did they yield.
You have 24 findings and almost 40 recommendations. What are the leading ones, and how do you suggest ensuring that this torture stops and is not engaged in again?
Oh, that's like asking which of my sons do I prefer. I think all of the recommendations were important, and I think that our recommendations and our findings were all important. I wouldn't particularly choose one over another. David may well on that, but I think that we really need to get the information out, because torture, I think, is not an American trait. It is not an American value. And until we get the information out fully and we understand what it means fully to the United States and our reputation, our system of values, I think you're going to continue to see polls that show the American people support torture because they see on the popular media that it works and that it's good theater. And I don't think that's what we should be standing for.
Let me just mention one of our recommendations that I think would do an enormous amount to prevent what happened from happening again. We discuss at some length in our report the influence of several memoranda that were issued by the Office of Legal Counsel in the Department of Justice. And when those memoranda were prepared by the small handful of attorneys who worked on them, there was a concerted effort made to freeze out of those discussions anyone who might have a contrary opinion about the legality of what they were proposing to do. And in this instance, specifically, the Judge Advocates General of the Armed Forces were frozen out of the discussion, and it was kept away from them because this little group of lawyers, civilian lawyers, wanted to be unimpeded in their ability to recommend to the president that he could do pretty much whatever he wanted with the CIA, and he could go as far as he wanted. Interestingly, to me, one of the recommendations in that collection of memoranda was, this may not be an exact quote, but it's pretty darn close. If the president decides something, it's not a violation of law. The last time any of you heard that statement was in 1968, I suspect, later than that, 1972, Watergate, when anything the president did, it's not against the law. It was that kind of a standard that was applied. And so there was a real concern among this group of drafters that we want to keep anybody who's got a contrary opinion away from this process. The service JAGs had a completely opposite point of view. They were frozen out. And when they expressed their opposition in memoranda to the Secretary of Defense, those memoranda were classified. Why? Probably not because there was anything secret about what they were proposing, but because they did not want public opposition by having the service judge advocates speak against their position. So one of the things we've recommended is that in the future, when the OLC goes through this kind of a drafting process, there would have to be an effort made to reach out and bring in recognized agencies who might have or might be expected to have an opposing point of view.
This is a crucial lesson. In fact, the OLC, the Office of Legal Counsel, which is the office in the Justice Department that provides legal advice to the president about the scope of his powers, has just released a fascinating new volume of previously secret opinions issued between 1934 and 1976. And they confirm your basic point that in the end it's public opposition that determines whether or not the president can get away with an assertion of executive power, that transparency is important, and who is part of the debate is crucially important. Just to read this volume and to see some principled OLC members arguing against President Roosevelt's illegal wiretapping, for example, and others supporting the internment of Japanese Americans reminds us of your point, General, that it really matters who is writing these legal memos. We have just a few minutes for questions, so let me ask my wonderful colleague Robin, who has the microphone, to come around and take your questions.
Is there ever a time that the Geneva Convention would allow their rules to be not applicable?
No.
Yeah.
Good question.
Same with U.S. law.
The follow-up question is, then who is responsible for enforcing the Geneva Conventions?
All of us. Our government is responsible for enforcing the Geneva Conventions. Under the Convention Against Torture, any signatory party who has reason to believe that there have been acts of torture within its jurisdiction or outside its jurisdiction and can investigate and prosecute is responsible to do so.
So Iraq could take this case before the UN?
Well, the United States is not a party to the International Criminal Court at The Hague for a number of reasons. But that would be the place where, in theory, the Geneva Conventions can be enforced, or if a nation such as ours has specific laws that prohibit violations of the Geneva Conventions, as we do, laws prohibiting the commission of war crimes, as we have an obligation under international law and federal law to prosecute individuals who are suspected of having engaged in that kind of conduct. We've made a decision as a nation not to do so.
Yes, ma'am.
The treatment of the hunger strikers in Guantanamo has been really grotesque, and I guess the hunger strike just ended yesterday. Why? This is such a block on the Obama administration. What's pushing them to do this?
I mean,
You probably have to ask them.
yeah.
It's so shocking. And Joe Nocera had a good op-ed piece saying it constituted torture.
Well, as I mentioned before, it is torture for those who have lost all hope and have been cleared of any of the crimes. And I would say that's torture also, that you cannot see your family, you can't, even though you're allowed to be released, you're not released, etc. I think it's not that the Obama administration is affirmatively trying to continue the torture. I think it's a neglect, quite frankly, and it's a neglect brought on by a perceived political problem that they don't have the power to do that. We briefed a number of people in the administration about our report after it was issued, and I was surprised at the high-level folks in this administration who felt that they could not release the 84 prisoners who had already been cleared for release because of political reasons, and that being the amendment that was put on the Defense Authorization Bill a few years ago, 3 or 4 years ago. We have a different opinion on that they should be released, can be released, and there are countries that will accept them and will actually meet the criteria of the amendment. So, I don't know. I don't quite understand why we don't close down Guantanamo, why we don't transfer the prisoners who are going to be tried yet to the United States. We can have them in our jurisdiction under our immigration laws, for example. We can and hold them under that, or we can hold them and put them into federal courts. There is a not in my backyard syndrome in politics today that we don't want them anywhere near us, if my district or my state or et cetera. I think that's wrong, that in those instances in which we have tried terrorists and convicted them, and they're in U.S. prisons today, it went off without any particular problems. And so I think we ought to take a deep breath, get beyond the petty politics of the day and move forward and do the right thing.
Let me just quickly add, our report is available online, www.constitutionproject.org. There's a section in the report that deals with hunger strikes at Guantanamo that's really well done, and it's worth reading if that's a subject that you're interested in.
Thank you for that. Yes, sir.
Just based upon what I just heard in the last hour, it sounded like a group of very well-informed and knowledgeable people have made a very stinging indictment on very specific people. You mentioned Rumsfeld. You didn't say George W. Bush. You just said several people in the White House. But you've obviously have very specific information about very specific people. And what I'm gathering is that you've got to a certain point where it might have been prosecutable, if that's a word, and it came down to the Obama administration said stop. And this doesn't sound like checks and balances in a constitution that I'm aware of. So maybe you can enlighten us a little bit more as to why this is not a constitutional problem and hasn't been addressed as such.
Well, I think it is a constitutional problem, but it's a constitutional problem that is wrapped up in our political process. And our political process at the moment and for the last few years has become, in my view, and I'm a Republican so I can say this, dysfunctional. And my party has had a lot to do with that. So it's one thing to say, yeah, someone should have gone after everything with as much aggressive prosecution as possible. I'm not sure whether, realistically, in view of the political climate that we find ourselves in, it's as easy to do that as we might want it to be or hope it would be. And Jim may have a completely different view of that.
I totally agree. I think it's a constitutional problem that should have been looked at from that vantage point. But the practical politics of the day is such that it will not be. And so I don't think there's any value in tilting against windmills, that we need to basically correct the policies and move forward in a better direction. The other part of it is not only do we have a dysfunctional Congress, it's a much different Congress than the one I was there, where Democrats and Republicans felt they were competitors, but they were not mortal enemies. And they could talk to each other as human beings. That doesn't exist today. And then when you view that with public opinion today, this is not like South Africa after apartheid, and it's not a truth commission in that respect, because you had a desire to get it out and move forward. You don't have that. The body politic isn't demanding that today. So I don't think that any particularly good would come from that kind of an exercise.
Well, we need to close, but we love here at the National Constitution Center and also at the Constitution Project to close on thoughts about constitutional constraints. And I think it was so interesting that this last question reminded us that although there are always good constitutional arguments to be made on any side of a question, they're often inextricably tied up to these questions of what the public will support. And that really was the most powerful memo in this recent OLC volume. Was written by a man with a poetic name of Golden Bell. And he wrote in 1937 that essentially whatever the public will support in foreign affairs the president can get away with, and what the public opposes determines the president's constitutional constraints. So that all means that raising public awareness of this issue and is crucial to creating public opposition. And for doing precisely that, I'd like to thank our panelists and the Constitution Project. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. All right.
Excellent discussion.
Thank you.